we're not teaching kids how the free market actually works. They think the free market is something of, like this horrible environment where people are just going after each other and are pursuing self-interest.
It's the
Not thinking that,
exploitation idea. Yeah, not that for private enterprise to work, for free enterprise to work, people have to freely exchange. And it's a high trust system. Again, the
voluntarily,
bank manager lends you
voluntarily, and
all
with
that money.
reciprocity of benefit,
That's
right?
absolutely right. So the bank manager isn't, when he lends you the money, he isn't in some way putting you down. He's actually looking after the savings that people like you have given him to look after. So he takes due care and attention over that. But he also trusts you to pay him back.
But this is socialism, isn't it? I mean, this is what the Greens are. It's what the Greens believe. They believe in the centrally controlled economy by government. It's never worked anywhere in the world, ever. Always creates more problems than it solves. And yet we see this happening again and again.
This is a very bad policy for renters. It's the type of thing that's appealing, that's populist, that looks like it's being compassionate, but it's completely going in the wrong direction if you want more rental stock, if you want more supply and actually lower rents.
Well, welcome to another episode of The Other Side Unplugged. And today we're going to be discussing a very important topic in this election, which I don't think has been spoken about enough. We've talked a lot about housing and the cost of housing, the cost of getting into owning your own home, but we haven't talked much about rent, what is happening to rents and how that's affecting young people and many people from other age groups as well in managing the cost of living crisis. Well, one organisation, a think tank based in Brisbane called the Australian Institute of Progress, you probably have heard of it before because we've had people from that institute on our show many times, and I personally am involved in that organisation as well. It is a centre-right think tank, to be completely transparent about it, but has commissioned independent research with an economics research firm to have a look at the impact of what would be the cost or the increase in our rents if some of the Greens policies were implemented around housing and taxes on landlords and rent caps and things like that. So to join me and explain this research and to talk about it today, we have, I'm very happy to say, on the show, the Executive Director of the Australian Institute for Progress, Graham Young, and also the man who undertook the research, the independent research for the Institute, from Adept Economics, Gene Tunny. Graham, to you first of all, why did you decide to commission this research?
Good. Thanks, Damian, and it's a pleasure to be on your show. The reason we decided to commission the research is that the Greens have made a demand of Labor that for their support in a minority government, and a minority government seems likely, they would require them to abolish negative gearing, double the capital gains tax, and put rent caps on rent. And it seemed to me that in the housing debate, we've concentrated on home ownership, but there's a lot of people and an increasing number of people because of the cost of housing who are trapped in renting, and that some of these policies do as much or more damage to renters as they can do to home ownership.
Yeah, it's quite amazing that the Greens are so committed to these three things. So abolishing negative gearing, doubling capital gains tax, and putting caps on rent. Just in simple economic terms, to you, Gene, I guess, what would be the impact, first of all, of caps on rent?
Well, I mean, this is the most damaging of the policies. I mean, I think they're both bad policies, but this would be truly economically illogical because essentially you're not letting the market adjust the way that it needs to be to send the right signals to build more housing. So there's an old saying in economics that the cure for high prices is high prices. I mean, the market sends a signal. If rents are high, then that's sending a signal that rental properties are in demand, that they should be built. But what's happening here is that you've got the government coming in and say, well, you can't charge what the market price would be. you've got to limit your rent. And well, what does that mean over time? It means there's not going to be enough rental properties constructed. It means that people who own properties, as soon as they get a chance, well, many of them, they won't rent them out anymore because, hey, I can't lift the rent. I've got all of these costs having a rental property. Uh, so there are all types of adjustments that will occur. And they're not the right adjustments. We're not getting more rental properties. We'll end up with a contraction of the supply of rental properties. And that's what we've seen in cities like San Francisco when they've done this. They had a 15% fall in the amount of housing stock for renters. So this is a very bad policy for renters. It's the type of thing that's appealing, that's populist, that looks like it's being compassionate, but it's completely going in the wrong direction if you want more rental stock, if you want more supply and actually lower rents. I mean, this is artificially keeping rents down, but what happens is that the market no longer clears, it no longer adjusts by the rent, by the price. It adjusts, it essentially is rationed. So the people who are lucky enough to get a rent controlled apartment will get one, but all these other people will miss out. So you'll have all these people having to live at home or live in, alternative arrangements.
Yeah,
Uh,
it
so
doesn't.
it's,
Yeah, it
yeah,
doesn't solve the underlying problem, and the underlying problem is a lack of supply and increased demand, which is
yeah,
economics. Grade one economics 101. If supply is low, then prices go up. If demand is high, prices go up. If supply is low and demand is high, prices go up a lot. And that's the situation that we're in at the moment. So the solution is to somehow reduce demand and to increase supply. And increasing supply means that, not putting penalties on property owners and landlords by having rent caps and trying to control the price. But this is socialism, isn't it? I mean, this is what the Greens are. It's what the Greens believe. They believe in the centrally controlled economy by government. It's never worked anywhere in the world, ever. Always creates more problems than it solves. And yet we see this happening again and again. In a political sense, and just coming back to you on this one, Graham, does it not amaze you that we just see this same old in this sort of thinking? And do you think that the Australian electorate is starting to wake up a little bit to, some of these nice sounding but incredibly simplistic and stupid ideas?
Look, I'm not sure that they are, Damian. I think it would be an incredible act of self-harm by renters to vote for the Greens with these sorts of policies. But renters are more like the younger people are more like the Greens voters. So there's a lot of Australians who are intent on self-harm because they just don't understand the situation. So they're given this model, you call it socialism, it's a sort of oppression model that private landlords are going to oppress tenants. So we need safeguards in there to protect tenants against landlords. So that's where something like caps comes in, capital gains and abolishing negative gearing. That's because they think these people are getting away with something on the tax system. So again, they're oppressing people more generally. One of the things they don't understand is that if you're an investor, you don't have to invest in housing. There are other things you can invest in, like, for example, shares. Now, just think about the return on housing. According to CoreLogic, it's 3.7% gross. That means that out of that 3.7%, you've got to pay the real estate's management fees, you've got to pay your rates, you've got to make an allowance for maintenance, capital depreciation. So it's not a 3.7 net return, and you've got to pay your own tax. If you go to the share market, there are a large number of shares, good, solid, reputable companies returning 4%. And that's net after they pay the company tax. So you get a credit for
Franking
that.
credit, yep.
Yep. They also pay all the management. There's an allowance in there for depreciation and amortization. If there's any borrowing for them, it's taken up in interest before they calculate that. And then they generally reserve at least that much again to grow the company. So if you're an investor and you're seeing your returns being squeezed on investment housing and you're being told by the Greens what to do, you're going to go somewhere where you're not going to be told. And there's a very obvious place to go, despite the turmoil that Donald Trump's causing.
Well, the interesting thing is that you can get an uptick in the stock market as well of a lot more than 4 or 5%. There's a possibility that you can do much better than that if you've got a good broker. You can also go to the bank and get a term deposit around 4% these days if you don't mind having your cash locked up. So if an investment property isn't returning 4%, it's kind of pointless. And the Greens would probably cheer and say, Yahoo! Well, that means that we've taken rental properties out of being an attractive investment, and housing shouldn't be an investment. Housing should be a social good. Gene, in economics terms, before we get to the political side of it, which I'll ask Graham in a moment, in economics terms, what is the logic of that statement? That housing should be a public good, and it shouldn't be something that we want to be turning into an investment.
Well, I don't see a lot of logic in it, honestly, Damien. I don't know if you've ever seen Dr. Zhivago, when you see the family, Zhivago's family, basically essentially booted out of their house in where is it, in Moscow, and then it gets overrun by people who just don't really look after it. So I mean, we need private property, okay? We don't want to have public housing because you end up with uh, I mean, people, it's expropriation. It really is Marxist. This is what we saw in the Soviet Union. I'd recommend anyone go and watch that scene in Dr. Zhivago and not be moved by it and realize the idiocy of that type of approach. And if you ever read, there's a great book, The Master and Margarita, which was one of the inspirations for Mick Jagger writing Sympathy for the Devil. And I don't know if you know the book, but they talk about, like, it's set in Moscow in I think it's the 1930s, and they talk about just how that much they hated the public housing, how much they hated having those communal kitchens and having to cook alongside each other. I mean, this type of approach where you try to socialize housing, it's just antithetical to notions of the family, to notions of the individual, to what we all believe in and aspire to. It's just idiotic. So I don't know if they believe in that, but yeah, I mean that is just completely nonsensical.
All right, we'll come back in a moment to get your thoughts, Graham. We'll just take a little bit of a break now and be back in a moment. I'm speaking to Gene Tunny from Adept Economics and Graham Young from the Australian Institute of Progress. We'll be back in a second with more The Other Side Unplugged. You may have noticed if you've been overseas on holiday recently that you can log into your streaming services like Netflix or Prime in other countries, but the shows they offer are different and sometimes even better. You're paying good money for those subscription services. Why can't you watch? Well, with a virtual private network, or VPN, you can log in from home here in Australia with an internet address from anywhere in the world, and big corporations and big government can't see where you are. Now, to be clear, criminals can still be actively found with police warrants, of course, but the average honest citizen will have their location protected from prying eyes of corporate marketers and government bureaucrats. If you sign up now with private internet access, we think they are the best VPN service out there. That's private internet access. As a viewer of The Other Side, you can get 83% off the price of your subscription and get online for less than $3 a month. Check it out right now. Go to piavpn.com/otherside. That's piavpn.com/otherside. It's a great service and a rock bottom price, and you're helping keep the other side going and growing. Well, welcome back to The Other Side Unplugged. We're speaking to Graham Young from the Australian Institute of Progress and Gene Tunny from Adept Economics. Graham, you've commissioned this research into rents. Let's get into some of the nitty gritty. It seems that the Greens' demands to abolish, and let's just be clear, we're talking about the Greens' demands because we are facing the very, very, sadly, very real prospect of a Labor, Green, Teal power shared government, because it doesn't look like the Labor Party will get a majority in its own right, although it is looking a little more likely than it probably did in a couple of weeks ago. But it is most likely still, as we said a couple of months ago on the show, after your last research was done, Graham, that we were probably going to see a hung parliament with Labor and the Teals holding the balance of power. Now the Greens and Teals holding the balance of power. Now the Greens are saying that they want to abolish negative gearing, double capital gains tax, and also put caps on rent. We've talked about the silliness of putting caps on rent. But let's talk about how much this is going to add. It's going to add more than $80 a week to average capital city rents on top of normal increases. And as you say, Graham, this is people just voting against their own self-interest. But here we are, three old white blokes, probably not many youngsters watching. We're talking to a bunch of other old white blokes on this channel, and some very smart women. But we aren't in this green voting demographic. How do you get through to the young? They don't want to be told. They don't want to listen. Graham, any thoughts?
Well, I think there's a couple of ways. One, in an election, you get through by dint of repetition. And if people have a nice hard round number, and $83 on average is a nice hard round number, they can relate to that. So you won't convince the majority of them, but I think that there's a percentage who are thinking, who possibly come from families who are middle class, and therefore they have some idea about how investments work, who'd be looking at that $83 and saying, that's about how much I'm saving towards my house deposit. And the house deposit that I need is much larger than it was even 12 months ago. I'm not going to get into the housing market unless my parents stump up. And people who aren't saving are going to say, well, there's my Friday night gone, or I can't go on an overseas holiday. What are these guys doing? And, I think you've got to talk to people at the most basic level, and that level is our wants and our needs. And the Greens talk to them in these airy-fairy terms. I think we need to talk to them in concrete terms. Longer term, though, I think we need to do something about the school curricula in all the states, because children are imbibing these sorts of ideas in school. They're not being taught how economies actually work, not even in the most vaguest and general senses. And I think that's something we need to do for the survival of our country as a viable entity. Because if we don't, then we end up with decades and generations of voters who don't understand how the whole thing runs, and they're fair game for these sorts of flim-flam proposals.
Well, that's where we are now, and I'll put my hand up and admit, that I graduated from not just high school, but I'd done a couple of years of university before I got my journalism cadetship, and my knowledge of economics was terrible. It wasn't until I was older that I actually understood it. So everything prior to that was very emotionally driven and emotionally based. And it sounds really nice when you say we're going to cap landlords, we're going to make landlords cap rents and keep rents low for the poor people. Well, yeah, the Robin Hood message constantly works, and people constantly fall for it. But let's have a look at what's going to happen if we see rent caps and if we see the abolition of negative gearing and the doubling of capital gains tax, as the Greens will do as they are likely to get some power in government after this election. So we have this chart, which I'll put on the screen now, which Adept Economics and Gene have put together. And it shows with the cities there on the left, and then we've got the weekly rents currently, and you're looking at the minimum increase we're likely to see that you've calculated, and the maximum increase, the upper bound increase that we're likely to see, and you've taken the midpoint there in the final column on the right-hand side, and we can see that the midpoint for Sydney is $95, so almost $100 a week in rental increase. $77 for Brizzy, $72 for Melbourne, Adelaide 69, Perth 84, and then we have the other capitals, Hobart, Canberra, Darwin, and it brings you to the capital city average of $83. Gene, anything we need to know about how you crunch these numbers and how you reached these figures?
Look, essentially what I did, Damian, was I did a cash flow model of an investment property at various different levels of leverage, types of loans, and worked out, well, what would policies like this? Now, I didn't model the Greens policy precisely. I modeled, well, what if you got rid of negative gearing and you halve the capital gains discount on all properties, so all investment properties. Now, I think the Greens have been saying they would confine it just to people who have multiple properties, but I mean, who knows what happens? And look, we don't even know if they will have balance of power. I mean, Graham's got a better sense of that. My sense is that the election swung back in Labor's favour, and Labor looks like it probably will get a majority, but who knows?
Okay.
Graham's probably better qualified to speak on that.
Yep.
But essentially, what I did was model the cash flows and discovered that broadly what it means is that the return over a typical investment would be reduced by 15%, broadly speaking, and then 13 to 16%, that type of range. And then if you think about, well, what needs to happen is that to get back to the old rate of return, and this could happen over time as people don't invest in property or get out of property, and so there's less supply available. The rental yield, what Graham was talking about before, that 3.8%, that has to that has to increase to compensate for
Yeah.
the loss of those tax benefits.
Yep.
And essentially, that's what I worked out, that the rental yield has to increase by, somewhere between 7.5 to 15%. Well, actually, it'd have to increase by around 15%. And
Mm.
then what I did then is I said, well, okay, what does the evidence say? Now, the evidence internationally is that about half, if you look empirically, that you can find, and this is where it gets tricky because trying to find this sort of stuff in the empirical data is difficult because there are a lot of other factors going on and the data aren't properly measured. But there are studies that show over the long run, half of an increase in the cost of having an investment property for landlords, that will be passed through to tenants. Now, I suspect it's a lot more than that. I suspect in the long run, it's probably the bulk of it is passed through by rents. But in terms of the evidence we've got, it's about half. So I said, okay, well, let's say the lower bound is 7.5% or so, and then the upper bound is around 15, and the midpoint is 11. I should have looked at the exact numbers, but essentially the midpoint's around 11. So let's say it's an 11% increase in rents you need to increase that rental yield
Yeah.
so that the
Get it.
investors get back to where they were before. And I
Right.
think in this housing market, so previously, I think economists, including me at times, have been, we've thought, okay, we may not see much of an impact on rents if there are changes to these policy settings, but definitely in the current market where we've got, uh, vacancy rates are very low relative to where they were when Labor was proposing changes back in 2016 and 2019, and we've got the, ongoing population growth, the shock from the high rates of immigration coming down, but probably not quickly enough. We've got dwelling completions running well below what they need to be to achieve the national housing target. I mean, this is a recipe for really a surge in rents if these policy settings are adjusted. It's a very risky policy.
Yeah. Okay. Also, I hear from the Greens a lot, this argument, or you see it online. Oh, there's tens of thousands of empty apartments in Sydney and Melbourne, just sitting there empty. We should allow people to go squat in them, or we should allow them, we should get them on the market for, there isn't a supply problem. I mean, of course, there's a supply problem, so that's complete nonsense. But why are those apartments sitting empty?
Oh, I suppose there are a whole range of reasons. I mean, it could be a deceased estate, and there's, it's unclear uh, who the owner is. I mean, there are some rare situations like that, I suppose. There are people who have a second house. There, people who are overseas for the time being. I mean, there's no doubt there are
There seems
properties
to be
that,
a lot of them.
well,
Graham, do you
yeah.
have a thought on that, or?
Yeah, so the figure for vacancies is something like 10%.
Right.
And, I think Gene would probably agree with me that that's about maximum capacity in any sort of system because you've got turnover. So another reason why they might be vacant is because one tenant's moved out and they're waiting to get another tenant in, or there's a
Mm.
renovation going on. There's a whole range of reasons.
Right. So there's always going to be a certain degree of vacancy
Yeah,
in a
so
market that's going to be
just
moving the
think of a
stock around. Yeah.
hotel as being a model of the housing market.
Yeah.
No hotel, unless they're doing something illegal, is
Yeah.
ever 100%
Sure.
full. There's
Mm.
always a vacancy factor in there. And if they were running at 100%, that would be a signal to build more hotels, but it doesn't
Yeah.
happen.
Yeah. They all run it try to get to about 80 or 90.
80, 90%. Yeah.
Yeah.
And same with
Okay.
that
So, all right.
development.
So, I wanted to just come back to the question of this idea that I think young people have due to that lack of economic education you were talking about earlier, Graham, that Gene mentioned about, hey, we need private property. We have to have private property ownership. Um, could I get you to comment on that as well, Graham? Why is private property, the concept of private property ownership, such an important thing for social justice and economic justice in our Western liberal democratic societies?
Well, I think at base, our rights stem from us being an individual with and all having equal worth, and to some extent, our property is an extension of us. It's the concrete manifestation of the things that we've done in the past. So the fact that you own a house means you managed to save a deposit, means you managed to go to a bank and convince them that you're a good credit risk. Uh, so to a certain extent, it is an extension of you, and so that's important in itself. But secondly, there's a whole lot of other factors which should preference private property over public property. And the strongest is that if you own something, you're much more likely to look after it than someone who doesn't own it. And in this housing area, the proof of that pudding is that public housing takes longer to build, costs more, and is less well maintained than the
Mm.
private landlords, because the state governments who mainly build them, it's not their money they're using. Did you know that the average cost of a welfare property, and we're talking about a 1 or 2 bedroom unit in Queensland, somewhere between $600,000 and $800,000? Well, that's not affordable.
No.
That's expensive. They build high rise for some reason, which is the most expensive way of trying to do things. If you were a private person with property, you'd never do that because you'd know you'd never get the return. And then it takes them forever. If you look federally, Anthony Albanese has built fewer welfare housing than even Scott Morrison, even though he's had a full term now to match him. So this government has proven at a federal level to be incapable of doing the construction project, which if you're a developer and you were depending on an income out of it, you'd make sure those things got built. There's been a lot of buildings constructed in the time that Anthony's barely been able to construct one.
This is the very thing, though. It's the very issue, isn't it? That we're not teaching kids how the free market actually works. They think the free market is something of, like this horrible environment where people are just going after each other and are pursuing self-interest.
It's the
Not thinking that,
exploitation idea. Yeah, not that for private enterprise to work, for free enterprise to work, people have to freely exchange. And it's a high trust system. Again, the
voluntarily,
bank manager lends you
voluntarily, and
all
with
that money.
reciprocity of
That's
benefit, right?
absolutely right. So the bank manager isn't, when he lends you the money, he isn't in some way putting you down. He's actually looking after the savings that people like you have given him to look after. So he takes due care and attention over that. But he also trusts you to pay him back. And in most cases, people do. If you look at your iPhone, the components for that come from all over the world. In fact, there's a famous essay, iPencil, where just a simple thing like the pencil, when you track where all the components come from, it is amazing. And there's not one person in the chain that knows exactly how to put that pencil together with all those components. But all these people trusting each other through systems of contracts and so on, make pencils. And not only do they make pencils, but they make wealth for themselves.
Yeah, I think that's a great point on
People,
which to just take our break. You're absolutely right. I would urge everybody who hasn't read iPencil or heard it read, or it's on Google. You can see it on YouTube. It's all over the place. iPencil is a classic explanation in simple terms of how free market economics and the invisible hand and the invisible benefit of free market economics works. And I think every kid should be taught iPencil at school. Maybe iPencil over iPod or iPad should be our message. But folks, get a look at that if you haven't seen it. It really is worth having a look at. We'll come back in a moment with more. We're speaking to Gene Tunny from Adept Economics and Graham Young from the Australian Institute of Progress. This is The Other Side Unplugged. The other side doesn't get more than $1 billion of taxpayers' money to bring you news from a centre-right perspective like the ABC does to bring you news from a left-wing perspective. In fact, we don't get a red cent from the government. We need voluntary donors and supporters like you to keep going and growing. And we hate asking for charity, so we've done a deal with what we think is the world's best VPN, virtual private network service. It'll keep you and your family truly safe without slowing down your internet speeds, and you can watch Netflix or other streaming services using your regular accounts with them as if you're viewing from any country in the world. And you can sign up for less than $3 a month and get a whopping 83% off the normal price. Just go to piavpn.com/otherside to sign up and get more info. That's piavpn.com/otherside. Welcome back. We have Gene Tunny from Adept Economics and Graham Young from the Australian Institute of Progress with us on this episode of The Other Side Unplugged. Election time it is at the moment in Australia. Gene, this is quite interesting research that you've done. It shows, as we said, that, if there were these sorts of restrictions, the abolition of negative gearing, the doubling of capital gains tax, or the reduction of the capital gains tax concession, caps on rent, all these sorts of green left policies that we're hearing from the Greens and to a lesser extent from Labor, if they were brought into effect, we would see, a double-digit increase in rents, and we would see a lot of people fleeing the market. Now, if the Greens put a cap on those rents and you couldn't do that double-digit increase as a landlord, then obviously you're going to leave the market. And I understand that your research shows that rent caps could prompt almost 500,000, or 450,000 rental properties to be withdrawn from the Australian market. The last thing we need right now, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's based on what happened in San Francisco, and I mean, it's a simple application of that percentage in that study. But that's a high quality study that was published in the American Economic Review, so it looks credible to me, and it seems plausible that that's the type of reduction you could see. Yep, and so it's the whole point about how the market is going to have to adjust by rationing the quantity, and those people who are fortunate to get a rent control apartment or a flat, good on them. But everyone else, a lot of other people will miss out. It's just dreadful policy. It's not sending the right signal to encourage new construction in rental properties, the properties that we need, because Australia's got a growing population. It's been growing very rapidly recently with the high immigration, but we're still going to have a growing population over the next few decades at least. So we do need additional supply.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to ask you the $64 million question that everybody's been talking about for years recently. But, in a nutshell, what do you see as the solution to the supply problem, and also to the excess demand problem, I guess?
Okay. So, I mean, supply, it's the things like ending all of these character overlays that just really hamper development. I mean, it's very difficult to develop anything in inner city Brisbane, for example. There are
So Sydney, Melbourne,
all...
Brisbane, we've all, Perth, Adelaide, everyone's got these character
Yes.
restrictions. Just to be clear what you're talking about, these are the restrictions on what you can do with a property to keep the character of the suburb and the look and feel of a suburb more, I guess, cozy, historic. Again, an emotional thing, but important to the visual environment, the people would say, that we live in. We don't want ugly development going on. Don't the Greens, let me play devil's advocate for a minute, but don't the Greens have a point with that?
Well, I think they do, but there are ways to increase density and increase it significantly without really destroying the character of the suburb. And people like Natalie Raymond from Yimby, she talks about gentle density. So there are proposals for gentle density. So we could, I mean, not necessarily high-rise apartments or apartment towers, but three or six-pack developments in the inner city suburbs. And you could do those in a way that are sympathetic to the existing housing that aren't eyesores. There are ways that we can do it, and we're denying ourselves these opportunities to increase density and help provide a solution on the supply side through these regulations that don't make sense. And there are a whole bunch of other things. Graham can talk to it. Ross Elliott did a great paper for AIP last year, I think it was, Graham, on other policies on the supply side. I might let Graham talk about that. On the demand side, I mean, we've got to cut immigration very substantially. It got out of control. I mean, I think by carelessness by both the previous government and the current government, the current Australian government, we ended up with over 500,000. What is it? 550,000 peak in net overseas migration, which is just far more than we can absorb. So we need to bring that down urgently, and then do all the work on the supply side too.
Yeah, you won't hear the Greens or Labor left talking about reducing immigration though, because that's racist. It's not racist at
Well,
all.
I mean, I'm not
So,
saying it's not racist. It's looking after
no,
Australians. And I mean, the Australian
yes,
government has to be devoted to the well-being of the Australian people primarily. Okay. So,
mm,
I mean, we've got a refugee program. So we're meeting our international obligations. The problems come from a lot of these international students we're bringing in. I mean, we're still being humanitarian, uh, but the problem isn't through our humanitarian actions, okay? It's through helping, provide additional revenue for the university sector.
exactly. Yeah, it's our export industry of university
Yeah.
sector turning into being used as a gateway to immigrate and not being used in the spirit of the law in which it was intended. Graham, I'll let you pick up on that supply side stuff that Gene was just pointing to. So a lot of research done by the Australian Institute of Progress into supply side issues other than character restrictions. But maybe let's talk about a few of those red and green tape factors again.
Yeah, yeah. So I disagree with Gene to a certain extent there that you're not going to solve this housing crisis with infill development, which is what he's talking about. It's difficult to do. You've got to wait for someone to die generally to buy the land or for prices to rise where something's worth more than it is as a building site than as a site for a house. So that takes a lot of time. What we need is brownfields and greenfields development. So an example of a brownfields development would be, for example, South Bank, where you had a whole lot of industrial properties, got demolished for Expo 88, and then it was available to be built on as a fresh development. Greenfields would be something like North Lakes or Forest Lakes in Brisbane or Springfields. You need those sorts of size blocks so that you can bring the development on with speed. We also need to unlock some of our fringe urban rural areas rather. So in fact, the state government in Queensland has just declared part of Thornlands a priority development area, and I think there's 40,000 people to go in there. However, there's some issues with that, and one of the issues is provision of infrastructure. And we really need to look at how we do that. At the moment, what we do is we charge the developer to provide the infrastructure. And just so your listeners know, or your audience knows what I'm talking about, we're talking about water, we're talking about sewerage, we're talking about electricity.
Hmm.
We're also
Roads, right? Also
talking
roads
about
to a certain extent.
upgrading roads,
Yeah.
sometimes rail. Even though a lot of these, so in the case of water and electricity, there's a user pays charge, which actually recoups the capital cost of doing it. So why should the developer pay for that? With roads, often there's some increased demand from the development, but a lot of it is to service demand that's already there. So, they'll demand that highways be upgraded, even though they're only adding maybe 4,000 car movements a day or something like that to it, and there might be 20,000 car movements already on it. So we've got to get smarter at how we do that, because what we do is we charge the developer. Well, the developer has to make a profit, so he charges the new home buyer. And there's been figures done on this, and I think the latest I saw was that taxes, infrastructure, and the whole lot add up to something like $300,000 on a block of land. Well,
Yeah, I
that
think
puts
that's right.
the
That
price of
was
the land up,
the
which
recent.
limits the number of people that can buy it. If it
Yeah.
was cheaper, a lot more people could get in there. So one of our proposals was something they do in some parts of the US where they actually raise a bond to fund the infrastructure, and then they charge people in the development a rate to repay that bond, which is the length of the bond is the lifetime of the infrastructure. So you get an uplift
Ah,
in your rates, but it's not front loaded onto the block of land. Now, that's not a perfect system because you're still double paying. You're still paying to have the infrastructure put in there, and then you're paying a fee which encompasses the cost of that infrastructure to the supplier. But at least it's not being front loaded onto your block of land. Uh,
interesting.
so that should allow a lot more of this sort of development to happen, both in these large lots, but also in some small areas where you've got smaller lots that need to be aggregated together.
So should the federal government really be pressuring states and councils then to um, make the access easier, reduce the regulatory burden,
Well,
but also obligate that level of government, state and local, to do their damn jobs and to build the roads and the infrastructure themselves.
yeah, well, look, the red tape's another issue that I didn't go into, and it's a bit hard to get your fingers on it because you've got to understand the process to understand the problems. But I'd say that the one policy out of all the policies that the two major parties have put out there on housing affordability that will actually be beneficial is the Liberal Party's policy to put 5 billion into infrastructure. But what I'd say to that is it's too little. 5 billion is not going to buy you a lot of infrastructure. I mean, I've seen for a subdivision with only 4,000 lots, 1 billion was the amount of infrastructure that was required by the various local government and state government bodies. So just use that as a crude rule of thumb. 5 billion will finance 20,000 dwellings, infrastructure for 20,000 dwellings as a crude rule of thumb.
Yeah,
If we're
interesting.
importing 500,000 people on average every year, you need about 220,000 houses or dwellings.
Right.
So you're only 20% roughly of what's required on that 5 billion. It shows the way, it shows state governments what they need to
Mm.
do. But in itself, it's only going to make a small difference. But at least it's heading in the right direction.
Yeah, that's the sort of policy we should be looking at. If it's the sort of thing governments should be doing, right? They always tend to meddle in the things they shouldn't meddle in. They never do the darn things that they're supposed to be doing. Just to
Yeah,
finish
they
off,
do. Go
Gene,
ahead,
do you want to
Dan.
jump in there
No, I
before?
was just going to say, yeah, Paul, they do things that look like they're helping, but aren't really doing much at all. Like that Housing Australia Future Fund, that is a bit of a failure, I'd say.
Yeah, it's all about it's all about how it's going to
Mm,
seem on the surface and the
yeah.
feels and the you can't. I mean, I could get into a whole we could have a whole discussion on communications and marketing and PR and everything and why the political communication requires all of that sort of surface emotional stuff. But it's a big problem because you've got to educate people because this stuff is actually hard and you've got to think about it on a level beyond just that sounds nice or as the Greens constantly doing their one level of solution, or basing everything on a Marxist idea of oppression and oppressed, which is just crazy. So, yeah, it's very difficult to get them to think two steps ahead. Oh, we'll just we'll just cap rents. Rents are too high. We'll cap the rent prices. Oh, hang on, that might have consequences. You never get that second step of thought happening, unfortunately.
Mm.
All right, gentlemen, to finish off, let's assume we have the less bad result of a full Labor government, a Labor government with its own majority and able to govern in its own right without having to rely on the Greens or the Teals. Um, Graham, where do you think that's going to take us policy wise? Do you think we will see the abolition of negative gearing, a reduction in the CGT benefits, or caps on rent or anything like that from Labor?
Well, you've just had the IMF come out today and say that Australia needs to trim its spending and decrease its debt. Whoever is elected after this election, even in the unlikely event that it's Peter Dutton, is going to have to do something about the mess that we're in. If it's a Labor government, they'll be looking around for fresh sources of income. They've toyed with this now over decades. So I think and we know that Jim Chalmers asked Treasury just last year to model the same thing that Gene's just modelled, but in terms of how much income would he get from it. So I think there's a chance that you wouldn't need the Greens to push too hard. And don't forget, they'll still have leverage in the Senate. For Labor to say, no, we've just won we've won an historic second term. We've got through one term with one whole Prime Minister intact.
That in itself's a bit of an achievement for anyone these days. So bravo.
That's right. Absolutely. We lost the voice and we lost a bit of confidence there, but hey, we've proven we can out campaign those libs. So here's a good idea. Let's do it.
Yeah. Okay. So a Labor government would be almost as bad as a Labor Teal Green outcome.
Look, you can't
I have to
spend.
pick you up on what you said that it's highly or unlikely that we would have a Liberal government. You really are. You really have feeling that negative at the moment. We are at the moment of recording this. We're what 10 days out.
Yeah, it's hard to see Peter Dutton picking up from here. He's had a shambolic campaign. When you're talking about cost of living as being the major electoral issue, and housing, I'd suggest, with rents having increased at twice the rate of other inflation, would be a central issue there. It's taken them 2 or 3 weeks to get round to that. Before that, the only housing issue that Peter Dutton raised was where he'd live if he won the election. That is from a campaign specialist point of view, which I have been in the past.
Yep.
That's a catastrophic thing for your leader to do. One, to be speculating that he's going to win the election, and then two, to be talking about this magnificent residence that he's going to live in, and what kind of arrangements he might have. And that was typical of the first few weeks of Peter Dutton's campaign. They're only now getting on to things like defence, when people have already started voting. And Anthony Albanese is looking much more confident. The Labor message that Dutton or cut, I think, has cut through. And they keep repeating the line, which is a complete lie, that his 600 billion nuclear plan, it's not 600 billion, and it would be something that would generate more income than it would consume, is going to mean he has to cut, and it'll be Medicare. I heard on TV last night, it's not just Medicare, it's NDIS, it's a whole range of social age pensions, whole range of social welfare measures. I think that's cutting through. They cite the CSIRO as being in favour of their costings, which again is a lie. But if you're a voter out there, you're not enthusiastic about either of the two parties. They're both leaders are in negative territory when it comes to approvals. You're going to vote against the one that you fear the most. And I think they've done a better job at making people afraid of Peter Dutton than he has of making people afraid of Anthony Albanese.
Yeah, bit of a sad state of affairs. Graham, thanks very much for your time. Graham Young, the Executive Director of the Australian Institute of Progress. Gene Tunny. Gene, do you want any final comments before we wrap up?
I'm probably, I think I've got a different view from Graham on what Labor would do if they did have a majority. I don't think Jim Chalmers is silly enough. He's obviously a very intelligent man. I think he realises that there would be adverse consequences from, abolishing negative gearing or changing capital gains tax. I wouldn't, they may tweak at it to some extent. They may start making changes, but I wouldn't expect them to embrace the policy advocated by the Greens. I think they'd be more sensible than that. Maybe they'd adjust some of the deductions that can be counted. Maybe. I'll have to think about it a bit more. But I'd be very surprised if they did anything, given Labor's past history with negative gearing and how much it cost them in 2016, 2019. Paul Keating's experience with it in the 80s when he suspended it for a while and then brought it back because the adverse impacts were starting to be felt and he was getting lobbied on it. I think Labor would be I expect they wouldn't really do much with it. Maybe they'll make a few tweaks, but they wouldn't be silly enough to try and embrace what the other parties are advocating.
Well, let's hope.
Gene, this is the man who wants to tax and is legislating unrealised capital gains. I think he's capable of anything.
Well, that I'm not defending that proposal, Graham. I'm just saying that,
That's
but you may
worse
well
than the
be right.
capital
You may
gains
well be
stuff.
right. Okay.
Well, Jim Chalmers, we've read his manifesto that he published, so we know where he's coming from. So maybe he is capable of anything, but the taxing of unrealized capital gains, boy, that's a terrifying thought, and a whole other issue which we might get into another time. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time this morning and this evening, and thanks for joining us for the recording. And we will look forward to having you both back on the show in the coming weeks to do a bit of a post-mortem on things. But thanks again for your time.
Thanks,
Damian.
The Other Side with Damian Coorey is Australia's best independent news commentary show, bringing you up to speed on the issues that matter most every Friday. Simply subscribe for free on YouTube by hitting the subscribe button and bell so you'll be notified whenever we post anything. And to really stay in touch, check out our independent website at othersidetv.com.au. You can sign up for free there too, or join the exclusive side and help support our show for less than $5 a month.